She was supposed to leave the hospital the next morning. Instead, her murder triggered one of Britain's largest fingerprint investigations. This is the true story of June Anne Devaney. Some crimes begin in places that already feel dangerous. Others begin where danger should never be able to reach. In the spring of 1948, Queen's Park Hospital stood on the edge of Blackburn, an industrial town in Lancashire, England. Its long wards, connecting corridors, and open grounds had grown from an older workhouse complex. To the families who brought sick children there, it was a place of treatment and recovery. But during one quiet night in May, a child disappeared from her hospital bed, and the only clear trace of the person who took her was left on a glass bottle beneath the cot. June Anne Devaney was 3 years and 11 months old. She was the daughter of Albert and Emily Devaney, a working-class couple from Blackburn. Later local accounts described Albert as a foundry worker and Emily as a mill winder, although fewer personal details about the family survive in the public record. What can be established is that June had been admitted to Queen's Park Hospital on May 5, 1948, suffering from a mild case of pneumonia. Her condition improved during the days that followed. By Friday, May 14th, she had recovered enough for hospital staff to plan her discharge the next day. For her parents, that meant the hospital stay was nearly over. June was expected to return home on Saturday. She never did. June was being treated in a children's ward known as CH3. The ward contained 12 beds, but only 6 children were sleeping there that night. June was the oldest among them. The room connected to smaller service areas and opened toward a porch or veranda. One exterior door had a defective fastening and could move when disturbed by the wind. That fault would soon become part of the investigation. The nurse on duty was Gwendolyn Humphreys. At around 12:30 in the morning, she heard a child crying and went into the ward to check the beds. June was still there. Nothing appeared out of place, and there was no visible sign that anyone had entered the building. That was the last confirmed moment June was seen safely in her cot. Less than an hour later, Nurse Humphreys noticed a draft. When she went toward the exterior door, she found it open. She closed it, then looked across the ward. June's bed was empty. The first reaction was a search of the immediate area. The nearby kitchen was checked, so were the lavatory and adjoining rooms. A child not yet 4 years old could not have traveled far alone, particularly in the darkness, but June was nowhere inside the ward. At around 1:30, the disappearance was reported to the nurse in charge. Police reached the hospital shortly before 2 in the morning and began searching the buildings and grounds. At that stage, officers still had to consider whether June had somehow wandered away. The hospital complex was large, the grounds were dark, and every minute mattered. Then the ward began to reveal signs that the child had not left by herself. On the polished floor, officers found impressions made by feet covered only in socks. Whoever had moved through the room appeared to have removed his shoes. Near June's cot, a large Winchester bottle used to hold sterile water had been shifted from its usual place and left beneath the bed. On the smooth glass were fingerprints and part of a palm print. The person who had entered the ward had apparently tried to move quietly, but in doing so, he had touched an object that could preserve the pattern of his skin. Before those prints could identify anyone, the search outside reached a section of grass near an 8-foot sandstone wall. At approximately 3:17 in the morning, June was found there, roughly 280 to 300 feet from the ward. Her father was brought to the hospital and identified her body. The medical findings confirmed that June had been sexually assaulted and killed in an exceptionally violent attack. The contemporary police account stated that her head had been struck repeatedly against the sandstone wall. Investigators also recovered blood, hair, fibers, and other material from the surrounding area. The person responsible had entered a children's ward, carried June into the grounds, murdered her, and escaped before anyone saw him. At 4:20 that morning, Blackburn's Chief Constable, C.G. Looms, requested help from Scotland Yard. Chief Inspector John Capstick was assigned to the case and traveled north with Detective Sergeant Stoneman. Local officers secured the hospital while forensic specialists examined both the ward and the place where June had been found. The strongest evidence remained the marks on the Winchester bottle. Detective Inspector Colin Campbell, a fingerprint specialist, studied the impressions and confirmed that they were clear enough for comparison. He also documented the sock-covered footprints on the ward floor. The bottle could place someone beside June's bed, but only after every person who might have handled it legitimately had been excluded. Police began with hospital employees, visitors, tradesmen, and others connected to the building. More than 1,000 fingerprint sets were reportedly taken from people associated with the hospital. None matched the unidentified marks. Investigators checked known offenders and men with histories of violence or sexual crime. They interviewed residents near the hospital, traced suspicious movements, and followed reports from the public. Every conventional route produced names, but none produced the hands that had touched the bottle. The investigation had reached a strange position. Police possessed a direct physical clue from the ward, yet they had no database capable of telling them who had left it. In 1948, fingerprint comparisons were performed manually. An examiner had to study patterns, ridge endings, loops, and other tiny features card by card. The killer's identity could be sitting somewhere in Blackburn, completely invisible unless police obtained his prints. So investigators proposed an operation on the scale that had never been used in a British murder inquiry in quite this way. They would seek fingerprints from tens of thousands of male residents and others who had been in Blackburn during the night of the crime. The campaign was voluntary but enormous. The town was divided into districts and officers went from house to house. They visited factories, workplaces, military establishments, and private homes. Cards were created containing identifying information and fingerprint impressions, then sent for examination. The exact age threshold and card format differ across later accounts. The surviving record also varies on whether the operation involved 20 or 30 officers at different stages. But the central fact remains clear. Blackburn became the center of a mass fingerprint comparison with no computerized assistance and no guarantee that the killer would cooperate. Week after week, the cards accumulated. Examiners compared each new set against the marks from the bottle. Most men were eliminated quickly. Others had moved away and had to be traced through different police forces. Soldiers and Royal Air Force personnel were contacted. Records were checked for men not listed on the electoral roll. Then the investigation slowed during Blackburn's Wakes Week, when many residents left the town for their annual holiday. Police turned to ration book and national registration records, looking for people who had escaped the earlier canvass. That search produced more than 200 additional names. Among them was Peter Griffiths. Griffiths was 22 years old and lived at 31 Burleigh Street in Blackburn. Contemporary accounts described him as a former member of the Welsh Guards, who later worked as a packer in a flour mill. He had not emerged through a witness statement, and no known personal connection linked him to June. He appeared because the fingerprint operation was designed to locate the men who had not yet been checked. On August 11, 1948, Griffiths provided his fingerprints. He did not refuse, and he did not attempt to escape. His card entered the same process as the thousands that had come before it. The following day, Colin Campbell compared Griffith's impressions with the prints from the Winchester bottle. They matched. After almost 3 months, investigators had reached the man who had stood beside June's bed. By then, more than 46,000 fingerprint sets had been processed. Many later sources give the total as 46,253. But a fingerprint match alone did not explain the entire crime. Police still needed to find Griffiths, question him, and determine whether other evidence connected him to the hospital grounds. According to the account published in the FBI Law Enforcement Bulletin the following year, officers arrested Griffiths near Moss Street at around 9:30 on the evening of August 13th. He initially denied ever entering the children's ward. Then, investigators confronted him with the fingerprints. As he was taken into the police station, Griffiths reportedly said words to the effect that if the prints on the bottle were his, he would tell them everything. He then confessed. Griffiths described entering the hospital grounds after drinking. He admitted going into the ward, removing his shoes, taking June from her bed, and carrying her outside. His account explained the sock impressions and placed him in direct contact with the bottle. Police then searched for evidence that could confirm details beyond the confession. A suit belonging to Griffiths had been pawned on May 31st, a little over 2 weeks after the murder. Investigators recovered the clothing through the pawn transaction. Forensic examination found blood staining identified as Group A, which was consistent with June's blood group, though not unique to her. Fibers from the suit were also compared with material recovered during the investigation. Campbell prepared enlarged photographs of the fingerprints and marked 16 corresponding ridge characteristics. The case against Griffiths now rested on several connected elements: the fingerprints and palm impression, the sock-covered tracks, his confession, the recovered suit, blood group evidence, and fiber comparisons. The question at trial would not focus mainly on whether he had entered the ward. It would focus on whether he was legally responsible for what he had done. Peter Griffiths went on trial at the Lancaster Assizes on October 15, 1948. Mr. Justice Oliver presided. Griffiths pleaded not guilty, and the defense presented psychiatric evidence suggesting that he suffered from schizophrenia. Dr. Alastair Robertson Grant supported the defense position and referred to signs of mental illness, as well as psychiatric problems within Griffiths' family. The prosecution called Dr. F. H. Brisby, the medical officer who had observed Griffiths while he was held at Walton Jail. Brisby rejected the argument that Griffiths met the legal standard for insanity and told the court that he regarded him as responsible for his actions. The prosecution presented the forensic evidence and Griffiths' statements. The defense did not succeed in persuading the jury that mental illness removed his legal responsibility. On October 18th, the jury retired to consider its verdict. The contemporary police-based account gives the deliberation as 20 minutes, while several later reports say 23. Whichever figure is used, the decision came quickly. Peter Griffiths was found guilty of murdering June Anne Devaney and sentenced to death. He did not appeal the conviction. The case was reviewed by the Home Secretary, but no intervention stopped the sentence. On November 19, 1948, Griffiths was hanged at Walton Jail in Liverpool. The fingerprint cards collected during the operation were not retained as a permanent record. Later accounts state that they were destroyed in accordance with assurances given to the public. For British policing, the case became a landmark. It showed that a stranger with no obvious link to a victim could be identified through physical evidence, systematic record checking, and a massive elimination process. The investigation did not succeed because Griffiths looked suspicious or because someone saw him enter the hospital. It succeeded because the police continued reducing an enormous pool of possible men until the prints on one card matched the marks on one bottle. But the forensic achievement can easily overshadow the reason the operation began. June had entered Queen's Park Hospital with pneumonia and had recovered enough to go home. She was less than 1 month from her 4th birthday. Her parents had every reason to expect that May 15th would be the day she returned to them. Instead, her name became attached to one of the most extensive fingerprint searches Britain had yet seen. The case leaves little mystery about who killed her. Peter Griffiths was identified through the bottle, supported by further forensic evidence, and convicted after his confession was presented in court. What remains disturbing is how little time the crime required. A defective door fastening, a quiet ward, and a short gap between nursing checks were enough for someone to reach a child who was supposed to be under constant care. Queen's Park Hospital continued operating for decades after the murder, and the old site later changed through demolition and redevelopment. The town moved forward, but the case remained part of Blackburn's history, studied by police, forensic specialists, and writers because of the investigation it produced. June Anne Devaney deserves to be remembered for more than that breakthrough. She was not merely the victim whose murder led to mass fingerprinting. She was a child who had recovered from an illness, whose discharge had already been planned, and whose family expected her home. The bottle beneath her bed helped identify the man who took her life, but the lasting truth of the case belongs to June.